Well, so great to have you here. My son and I were sitting over here talking about how to get that table from that side of the stage over to here. As we were contemplating that, we got put on the wrong side of the stage, and my wife just intuitively walked up and carried it out here, and Elijah leaned over and he goes, "That's a squad goal right there." And so shout out to my wife for doing that for me. Thank you. My name is Justin. I'm one of the pastors here at Hope City. I'm so glad that you guys are here. Last week was our grand opening, and I know that we have a ton of first-time guests here today. I met several of you out in the lobby. By the lobby, I mean right behind that curtain. And so if you're new here today, there's good news. We were only here for 2 weeks, all right? So we're new here too, and so it's great to have you guys here, and I'm really excited to dive into what we're going to talk about over the next few weeks. And as Brendan mentioned, we have this app called the Hope City app, and if you go onto Google Play, or if you go onto the App Store, if you have Google Play, I'm shocked. But if you have it, you can go there, and you can download, just search for Hope City Indy, I-N-D-Y. It's going to come up, and all the message notes from today, all the scripture we're going to use, all the message notes are right there, that you can follow along with the message as we go along, if you'd like to do that. But over the last few years, my wife and I have traveled around the country. We wrote a marriage book about 3 years ago, and we have had the opportunity to speak at a number of different churches across the country on relationships. It's kind of what we have. It's been our full-time job really for the last 3 years. So we've interacted with a lot of people, talked to a lot of people and about relationships. It's kind of what we have studied and made kind of our mission is to help people improve their relationships. And one of the things that has bothered me as I've looked back at my life as a pastor is so often I have equated behavioral modification in relationships with heart transformation. And so what I have been guilty of, and I think the American church is guilty of, is we tend to give 5 happy hops to great relationships, and that equation does not work out for most people. So we have 5 happy hops to a better marriage, 5 happy hops to better friendships. Here's how you have a great dating life. And we have focused on giving people information about relationships, but we have failed in the church to encourage people to submit to allowing God to transform their heart. And so over the next 4 or 5 weeks, as we go through this series, one of my goals, one of my hopes is that if you are in a relationship, okay, if you have any relationship in your life, this series is for you. This isn't going to be a marriage series. It's not going to be a parenting series. It's going to be a series where we can look at and do an inventory of the relationships in our life and ask God to invade them. And ask God to show up in them. And for some of you, that's going to start in your relationship with God. Some of you, maybe this is the first time you've been to church in a long time, and we stalked you on Facebook, and everywhere you clicked, like, we're there, right? You're like, what is going on? I give up, I'm going, right? For some of you, you got a mailer in the mail, and you're like, oh, this is a coincidence. I'm new to town. This is a coincidence. I was just talking to somebody about that church, and so you showed up, and our hope is that if you'll travel with us for the next few weeks as we go through this relationship series, your relationship with God will be different, and your relationships in your life will be different as a result of spending an hour a week with us here at Hope City. So that's our goal. Well, I'm going to talk to you today about a principle that I think is going to transform every single relationship that you have. I know that's a big goal, but I think there's one biblical principle we're going to look at today that if we apply it to our lives, it has the potential to make any relationship that you're in better. It can make a bad relationship good. It can make a good relationship great. And it's the concept of being a peacemaker. And it's not something that we talk a lot about in the church. We're going to look at this passage of Scripture out of Matthew chapter 5 here in just a second. But when I was going into my freshman year of high school, somewhere between my 8th grade and my freshman year, my sister is 2.5 years younger than me. And we did not get along growing up. We fought literally, I mean, just a lot. We just argued a lot. We hung out a lot. We moved a lot as kids, so we kind of only had each other to kind of hang out with sometimes, because we were the new kids a lot in different neighborhoods, different places. But at the same time, we were really good at arguing. And my family in general was good at arguing. We could have gone pro. Okay, we had arguing with one another. And one particular argument my sister and I got into stands out among all the rest. My mom had just come back from getting groceries, and so she's carrying groceries in from the garage, and I'm getting ready to eat lunch. And so I'm sitting at the dining room table. My mom's coming in. She's putting groceries on the dining room table. And my sister kind of walks out of the living room, into the dining room, and into the kitchen. And I said, hey, and I called her a name. And I don't know why I called her a name, but I just wasn't happy with her. I called her a name. I said, give me a fork. And so she comes back, and I'm sitting at the table, and she goes, here's your fork. And she flings it like that, and it sticks right in my leg. Like just boom. It felt like it went to the bone, all right? And I'm a hypochondriac. I'm like, oh my gosh, I going to bleed out? You know, and so I'm freaking out. I start screaming. She starts screaming, and she starts running. Well, I have a fork in my leg, so I cannot chase her. So I look on the table, and there's a bottle of shampoo. So I grab the bottle of shampoo, and I take this bottle of Head and Shoulders, and I throw it toward her Head and Shoulders, right? And I try to nail her as hard as I possibly could. And I hit her right square in the back, and she just goes down. So she's laying on the floor crying, bottle of shampoo next to her. I'm sitting at the table bleeding with the fork sticking out my leg. My mom walks into this crime scene. She's like, what in the world is going on? And so I told my mom that my sister basically tried to kill me and that she should be arrested and put in jail for the rest of her life. My sister tells my mom that I tried to kill her with shampoo. And there's two sides to every story, right? So we're sitting there, we're arguing back and forth, and finally she's like, Justin, apologize. I'm like, I'm not apologizing. She should be in jail, right? And she's like, we're in America, apologize. My sister's like, I'm not apologizing. He almost killed me. So my mom takes two chairs. She sits them in the living room. She sits us in the chairs facing each other, knee to knee. And she says, you guys have to sit here until somebody apologizes. I would still be sitting there, I'll tell you that right now. Right? We sat there for what seemed like hours, and I was not going to apologize. And no talking, you look at each other, you do not say one word to each other unless it's, I'm sorry. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, there is no chance I'm apologizing to her. Not one chance. So we sat there for a couple of hours, just back and forth, just stubborn as all get out, not apologizing. Then a buddy of mine comes over, he's like, hey, you want to go play some basketball? And I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm out. And so I left, right? And I think when we think about peace in relationships, that's the picture we get. That we offer apologies even when we're not sincere. There's this passage of scripture in Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 in the New Testament, if you're familiar with the Bible, if you're not familiar with the Bible, the first 4 books of the New Testament are called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and basically it's about the life of Jesus. And a lot of Jesus' teaching is recorded in the book of Matthew. And in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is giving his very first sermon. And it's really just a masterful sermon of how practical it is, how he is so eloquent, how he speaks, and how it's so understandable. And people really started latching on to the way that Jesus was teaching. And so he starts giving these principles in Matthew chapter 5 of how to live in this new kingdom he's coming to create, how to live in this kingdom of God that he was coming to talk to people about. How do we relate to one another? How do we reconcile with one another? How do we live with one another in love and not judgment is basically the message that he was bringing. And so Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, it says this, blessed are the peacemakers. For those of you that are a little bit younger, blessed are the peacemakers instead of blessed. I don't know why I went there, but blessed are the peacemakers. I just had like a little 1976 preacher come out there right there. So blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are the peacemakers, who will be called children of God. And so often when we think about peace, what we really think about is the absence of conflict, or making conflict go away. We equate peace with something not being present rather than something being present. I'll have peace in this relationship if we can just get rid of this conflict. But the definition of peace that I want to share with you today is something completely different than that. It's not the absence of conflict, it's the presence of something right. The definition I want to work off today is this: that peace is the pursuit of what is right that allows a relationship to be restored. Peace is the pursuit of what is right that allows any relationship that you're in to be restored. It doesn't mean that it will be restored. It just means that it sets it up to be restored. It's making right choices. It's pursuing what is right for that relationship to be restored. Independent of what someone else does, independent oftentimes of even how you feel, it's still choosing to do what's right and trusting that right feelings will follow right actions, and you're going to give a relationship the chance to be restored. Peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the intentional presence of what is right in a relationship. And peacemakers pursue what is right. And as they pursue what is right, restoration is possible. Peace isn't passive. It's not lazy. You'll have to choose it. Oftentimes you'll have to fight for it, which is kind of an oxymoron, that you'll have to fight for peace. You'll have to go against everything that is intuitive, and you'll have to choose to be a peacemaker. It's not going to come naturally. But Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the people who make peace. And so as we kick off this Squad Goals series, one of the goals I have for us as a church is that we would be people of peace. That we would be people who pursue peace in relationships, that we would be a church that is known for how well we love people in this community. And so I just want to give you 3 character traits of peacemakers that I think come right out of Scripture. And the first one is this: peacemakers are ruthlessly committed to truth-telling. Peacemakers, if you're going to have peace in your relationships, you're going to be ruthlessly committed to truth-telling in those relationships. Look at what it says in Ephesians chapter 4. It says, instead, we will speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of his body, the church. You know, as people who are in relationships, it doesn't matter if you're in a dating relationship, a friendship, if you're engaged in here, or if you're married. It doesn't matter your marital status. It doesn't matter your socioeconomic status. The greatest desire that we have as human beings is to be known. All of us want to be known. That's why it's so intimidating to come to a place like this, because you don't know anybody for the most part. Right? And what you're thinking as you're walking down the sidewalk is, am I going to feel comfortable? Am I going to feel like I belong? And as you get deeper in relationships, that desire becomes greater. And that's why you connect with certain people, because you feel like they know you. If you're dating somebody and you have that sense of that relationship is going somewhere, it's going somewhere because you've allowed them to get to know you. If you're married, you stood at an altar and you said, hey, I want to know this person. I want this person to know me more than anybody else has ever known me. It's our greatest desire. You know what our greatest fear is? Not being loved. We're fearful of not being loved. And so we oftentimes make choices in our life and choices in our relationship not based on our desire to be known, but out of our fear of not being loved. And so we compromise truth in relationships. We withhold truth in relationships, not because we want to be liars or we want to be deceitful, but because we want to be loved. And we put a pain quotient on every relationship we have, and we think, that's as much truth that person can handle about me, so this is as much truth as I'm going to give them. And what happens is, in our minds and in our hearts, we're not trying to sabotage that relationship. We're trying to protect it. Right? Because we think if they knew the truth about me, they wouldn't love me. And I want them to love me. And so I'm only going to give them partial truth. And every time you and I offer partial truth in a relationship, we place a lid on that person's ability to know us. We place a lid on that relationship's ability to grow. Not intentionally, but it's a principle that you can't get away from, because God has created you to be known. To be known by Him, and to be known in relationships with others. Last Saturday, my son and I got into a huge discussion. And by discussion, I mean argument. Flat out. Just knock down, drag out. My wife says that we're oil and water. Elijah and I say we're not oil and water, we're oil and oil, because we're exactly alike. And we have the same personality, same idiosyncrasies, the same temperament, and we have the same debating skills, and we both think that we're right all the time. And so it just plays out in just an unbelievably fun relationship at times. And so one of the things my wife's been working with me on is not blasting Elijah right when he comes in. Okay, 17, give him some time before you lay into him. Don't just blast him right when he walks through the door. And so I was really frustrated with him last Saturday, and so he came home, and I was just like counting my mind. Okay, can I talk to him now? Can I yell at him now? Can I get on him now? He goes and gets a bowl of cereal. He sits down. I'm like, okay, is that enough time? Can I get on him now? He turns on the TV. I'm like, can I get on him now? He changes the channel. I'm like, that's enough time. It's over. All right, and I just go after him. I'm like, you're so mad all the time. You're resentful all the time. You're up in your room all the time. You're so disconnected from us. I just don't get it. I just don't understand it. It's wrong. You need to apologize to Mom and me for how disrespectful you're being. And he's like, you know what? I am bitter. I am mad. I'm harboring bitterness towards you. I started at a level 8 instead of a level 2 on things, and I'm sorry, but that's just how I feel. And he starts listing all the reasons why he's mad at me, of which none of them were right. All right? And I proceeded to tell him how he was not right and being mad at me for those little things. And he said something that was very interesting. He said, Dad, just because you don't think I'm right doesn't change how I feel. And so we both were crying. We're both emotional. And we're both crying, and so we talked for another 30 minutes or so, and he stands up and just comes over and gives me a big hug. He's like, oh, I just feel so much better. And I'm like, why? Because you just kicked me in the teeth? Like, why do you feel better? He's like, no, I just needed to say that for a long time. And I'm like, why did he say it? He's like, I wanted you to get through the grand opening. I was holding on to it, just till you get through the grand opening. Because I know how big of a deal that is. See, I think in our relationships, we think that we're helping a relationship by withholding the truth of how we really feel. And what happens is, when we don't speak the truth in love, we create distance in a relationship that we never intended to create. And things don't get easier or better or more loving. They get harder and more distant and less loving. And we wake up one day and we're like, how in the world did my friend and I drift so far apart? How in the world are my husband and I so disconnected? How in the world are my parents and I living in the same house with parallel lives, different lives? How did that happen? It's not intentional. But being a peacemaker is intentional. You have to choose it. We equate being passive with being peacemaking, with peacemaking. But the byproduct of living with withheld truth in your heart isn't intimacy. It's not closeness, it's bitterness and passive aggressiveness and fractured relationships. And God says, hey, if you're going to be a peacemaker, you're going to have to be ruthlessly committed to telling the truth. And maybe you've been hurt in a relationship, maybe you've been let down, maybe you've been disappointed, and you haven't said anything in an effort to keep the peace. My guess is you probably don't have peace in that relationship. My guess is your attempt to create peace by being passive is only making things worse. And can I just share something with you this morning? That peacekeeping is not the same as peacemaking. If you're trying to be a peacekeeper, you're probably miserable. Because peacekeeping isn't the same as peacemaking. Jesus doesn't call us to live a life of peacekeeping. Jesus calls us to live a life of peacemaking. And if you've been offended in a relationship, peacemaking means telling the truth in love to someone about how you feel for the purpose of reconciliation. It's sharing the truth to try to restore the relationship. And so maybe just a real practical thing you need to do is you need to call someone on the way home from church or on the way to lunch. And you need to say, hey, I've been wounded by you, and I thought it was going to go away by ignoring it, but it's not. I don't want to be sideways. I want to be angry. And so can we get together for a cup of coffee, or can we talk later on? I know I'm dropping this on you. I want to give you a chance to process it. Can we get together and talk through this? There's another side of this whole equation too. How many of you have ever been let down, offended, lied to, disappointed, or taken advantage of by someone? Show of hands. Okay, the rest of you are lying, okay? Because that happens in relationships, all right? And you're not making peace with me by lying to me, okay? That's not, you have to tell the truth. All of us in relationships have been let down, disappointed, or taken advantage of. It's just what happens in relationships. But you know what the other side of that is? You've been that person to someone else. You have been the offender to someone else. You've hurt someone. You've disappointed somebody, whether intentionally or unintentionally. You've lied to somebody. You have compromised trust in a relationship. Unless you're absolutely perfect. You've done that. I love what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 23. He says, therefore, if you're offering your gifts at the altar and remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come offer your gift. This is a powerful statement. This is so counterintuitive to the Jewish culture. The Jewish culture pretended like everything was okay, even when it wasn't okay. Sound familiar? And Jesus is saying, hey, if you are at a worship service and you know that you've offended someone, before you offer a prayer, before you sing a song, before you raise your hands, before you give an offering, before you listen to a message, before you do anything, if you know that you've offended somebody, leave. Don't come and offer me your half-hearted worship when you know that you have full-heartedly restored a relationship. That's what Jesus is essentially saying. Jesus is saying, I would rather you not worship me. I would rather you not offer your gift. I would rather not have your gift of what you think you should give to God, your religious duty, because your religious duty isn't as important as that relationship. And so if you know you've offended somebody, he says, I want you to leave and go. Don't offer your gift until that relationship is at least attempted to be restored. And this would have been so earth-shattering to these people. Because relationships with people weren't as much of a priority as a pretend relationship with God. They thought that culture thought they could behave their way into good graces with God. They thought they could behave their way into impressing God enough. And so Jesus is saying, hey, you know what? Your religious pretense, it doesn't work in this new kingdom. What I'm concerned about is your heart. I want to know that your heart is whole. I want to know that your heart is restored. And that happens as you restore relationships. And so if you've offended anybody, offer an apology. If you let anybody down, own it. If you've wounded somebody, have a conversation with them. And when that takes place, then come offer me your worship. And that's such a radical difference in relational, in how these people would relate to one another. The second characteristic is peacemakers are humble enough to pray for their enemies. Peacemakers are humble enough to pray for their enemies. Matthew 5, he continues in this message. He says in verse 43, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Now, if you look at the New Testament, all throughout Jesus' teaching, he has a phrase that he uses quite a bit. He uses this phrase that he uses here in this verse, in verse 43. He says, you have heard it said, but I say to you. And the reason why he says that over and over again in his teaching is because in that culture, unless you were a rabbi of very high stature, you never taught a new principle on your own. In other words, you would never just offer a truth and have it stand on your own credibility. You would always have to quote another rabbi. You'd always have to quote somebody else who had taught that principle unless you had very high standing in the temple. And so Jesus is here is breaking tradition. He says, hey, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you. They would be expecting him to quote another rabbi. And he is saying, hey, in my kingdom, in this new community that I'm ushering in this new way of living that I'm introducing, we're going to be marked not by hate, but by love. We're not going to retaliate hate for hate. We're going to retaliate hate with love. And nobody else is quoted except me. You've heard it said, but I say to you. And in other passages of Scripture, it says the people were in awe because he taught as one who had authority. It's a way different way of thinking than anything they'd ever experienced. People in Jesus' kingdom will be humble enough to pray for those who persecute them. And they had to be thinking, Jesus, are you crazy? Do you know how many people have persecuted us? Do you know how many people have oppressed us? Do you know how many countries have taken us into captivity? Do you know how many years we spent in slavery? And you want us to pray for people who are against us? You want for us to pray for people who are persecuting us? Really? That's your plan? Jesus is saying, hey, if you're a peacemaker, if you want to live in this kingdom, it's radically different. It's upside down from however you're thinking it's going to work because we're going to be people of love. And the way that I've seen this play out in my own life is in my marriage relationship. You know, the people that you wound the most are the people that you love the most. You know that, right? Like you're the closest people to you are the ones that wound you the most because you're the most vulnerable with them. Doesn't mean that they're your enemies, but it does mean that you are enemies for a season, right? Sometimes for a week or two. And as Trish and I have gone, we've been married for 21 years, and we got married when we were 12. That's not true. I just wish it had worked. But as we've gone for the first 10 years of our marriage, we were all about peacekeeping and not peacemaking. And when you're in a marriage relationship or any relationship where you're trying to keep the peace, you're miserable because you're always walking on eggshells. You're always worried about offending somebody. You're always worried about making somebody mad. You're always worried about getting yelled at. And you're never fully engaged in that relationship because you're always scared you're going to make the other person angry or let them down or not come up to their expectations. And that was our marriage relationship for the first 10 years. About 6 years ago, I decided to start praying for Tricia. And for the first 10 years of our marriage, I prayed that God would change her because he needed to, okay? Drastically. But he never answered that prayer. And so then I started thinking, well, why don't I start praying that God would change me? God, if you're not going to change her, maybe you could change me. And so when we get disagreements, we get sideways with one another, I just start praying, hey, God, would you change my heart? Would you transform me? Would you help me to see her the way that you see her? And here's the deal. When you start praying for someone who's hurt you, when you start praying for someone who's offended you, it doesn't guarantee that the relationship is going to change. It doesn't guarantee that that person is going to change. But I do guarantee you that you'll change. Your heart toward that person will change. And the relationship may never be the same. And God may never restore it, but he'll restore your heart. He'll allow you to experience health in your heart, even though the relationship might not be healthy. Because I've seen it happen over and over and over again. When you humble yourself enough to pray for someone who's offended you, what you're saying is, God, I'm elevating this relationship above myself. I'm saying that this person means more to me than being right. This person, God, means more to me than the point I'm trying to make. And so often I think we're so bent on making a point that we break relationships. And God's saying, hey, would you just stop trying to be right all the time and just pray? Pray for that person and watch me maybe not even transform them, but transform you. It's a powerful principle, and it's hard. It's not easy. It's awkward. It doesn't feel like it's actually something tangible. But if you'll humble yourself, God shows up in hearts that are humble. God loves to work with people who place his value system above their own. It's interesting, the outcome to peacemaking. It's mentioned in verse 9 of Matthew chapter 5, and it's mentioned here again in verse 45. In verse 45 it says, pray for those who persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father in heaven. So it's the second time in this chapter that Jesus equates relational reconciliation with being children of his. He says, hey, when you live in a reconciling, restoration mindset with other people, it identifies you as my child. Verse 9, he says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they'll be called children of God. Here he says, for they will become children of God. What's Jesus saying? He's saying God is a peacemaking, peace-loving God. And when you and I take on that character trait, we resemble his love and his desire to be in a relationship with a watching world. And it's sad that the church has become a place that's not equated with peace. It's not even viewed as a place to go to find peace. It's viewed as the cause of unrest for so many people. What if we were different? What if we said, okay, God, we want to be a place, we want to be a church that offers peace to one another and to this community. God shows up because that is what a child of God does. Finally, as we close, peacemakers pursue reconciliation at the risk of their own comfort. Peacemakers pursue reconciliation at the risk of their own comfort. Look at verse 46 and 47 of Matthew 5. It says, if you love if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? It's funny that he just uses that as an illustration. Tax collectors were viewed as crooks, especially Jewish tax collectors. They were viewed as people who sold themselves out to Rome. So they were like the lowest of the totem pole. So he's saying, aren't the tax collectors even loving people who love them? Verse 47, if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Don't even the pagans do that. Don't even people far from God greet people who are just like them? Don't people who are far from God like hang out with people who are just like them? What is differentiating about that? How does that set you apart in any way? How will people know that you're following me if you're only living in your comfort zone? If you're only doing what's comfortable for you? When I was growing up, I mentioned earlier, my family was very volatile. It was we were walking on eggshells. My dad worked like 6 days a week, 80 hours a week, and my parents didn't really argue that much except when they were together. And so, which is usually on Sundays. And so Sundays was either a very high or a very low. And we'd either get in a huge argument on the way home, on the way to church, and have to pretend like everything was okay at church, or we'd get in a huge argument on the way home, and the whole afternoon would just be wrecked. And I mean, dishes were thrown, and names were called, and screaming matches, and it was bad at times. My dad would leave for 2 or 3 days at a time. And I was the oldest, and so I'd go gather my siblings up, and we'd go hide in the closet or go hide underneath the bed until like the tornado had blown through. And there'd just be carnage all over the place, and we'd come out and try to start cleaning up our lives emotionally from what had just taken place. It was just bad. And I carried that mindset into my marriage. Like when conflict came up in my marriage, I would just want to go and hide. Because I equated conflict with failure. Like if we're having conflict in our marriage, then I'm failing as a husband. If I'm having conflict with a friend, I'm failing as a friend. If I'm having conflict with a family member, I'm failing as a family member, because good relationships don't experience conflict. And so some of us in here, we are hiding in relationships, hoping that that relationship gets better. You have experienced distance with a family member, you've experienced distance with maybe an ex-spouse, or an ex-boyfriend, or an ex-boss, and you think that that relationship is going to heal over time if you just ignore it. If you stop it, if you don't text them as much, if you don't show up at family dinners, if you're not present, then it's just going to get better. And so you try to avoid them and hope that the relationship heals. But that isn't how reconciliation happens. You're going to have to go outside your comfort zone. Avoiding conflict, and this is mostly for guys, okay? Guys, we need to hear this. Avoiding conflict isn't the same as resolving it. I would just assume that if my wife and I weren't arguing, we were good, right? We may not talk for 4 days, right? But hey, we're not arguing, we're good, because I'm avoiding conflict. Think about your relationship with God. Those of you that have walked with God for a while. Have you grown closer to God when everything has been great? When you've experienced all kinds of success and everything has just been off the charts amazing and finances are awesome and relationships are unbelievable? Is that when you have grown closer to God? Or have you grown your closest to God and experienced God's presence the most during times of despair or heartache or disappointment or loss or failure? See, God longs to leverage those things in our life to draw us closer to Him. And He does the same thing in conflict in our relationships. But avoiding it isn't going to bring closeness. You're going to have to lean into it. You're going to have to embrace conflict and use it as a catapult to get to know that person more. It's more comfortable to avoid it. It's more comfortable to keep the peace than to make peace. And if we're really honest, that's why some of us feel trapped in a relationship. And that's why some of you feel trapped in a marriage, because you've been spending your whole married existence trying to make peace. That's why some of you feel so distant from your parents, because you're just trying to make peace. You're just trying to make them happy. You're not really trying to pursue their heart. That's why some of you go from job to job to job to job, or relationship to relationship to relationship. Every time conflict comes up, you're out. Well, that job just wasn't what I thought it was going to be. My boss doesn't like me. Well, that dating relationship wasn't what I thought it was going to be. We're just not clicking. And the only common denominator in the whole thing is you and your view of conflict. And God's saying, hey, I can't transform your heart if you're avoiding something. So will you lean into it? Will you lean into conflict and allow me to transform you? Now I want to make one final statement before we close, because I know some of us are going to leave here, we're going to feel guilty. We're going to carry relational guilt. Okay, we carry it anyway. We're going to think that we're not enough because a relationship has failed. And the final point I want to say to some of you is this. Peacemaking isn't the same as peace achieving. Peacemaking is not the same as peace achieving. There are some relationships that cannot be saved. There are some relationships that should not be saved. They're toxic. I love what this passage says in Romans chapter 12. It says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And I love the heart of the scripture saying, hey, do everything you can. Shove everything to the center of the table to try to save a relationship. Be humble. Pray for those who have hurt you. Pursue that person's heart, if it's possible. Do everything you can to save it. But there are going to be times that a relationship can't be saved, and that's not on you. Maybe your father has died, and there's no way you can have reconciliation. Maybe your brother-in-law won't return your calls. He's given up on that relationship. Maybe it's an ex-spouse or an ex-boyfriend or an ex-boss that's not even in the picture anymore. They've been out of your life for years. You're never going to be able to make that relationship right. God is saying, hey, do everything possible and then trust the results to me. Allow me to restore your heart, even if that relationship isn't restored. God says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And I couldn't think of a better way to kick off this Squad Goals series, because we all want great relationships. We all do. It's our greatest desire. They don't happen passively. They happen as we pursue God and allow Him to transform us into the people that He longs for us to be. Let's pray together. As we're sitting here this morning, as the band comes up to close in a song, I just want to give you guys a moment just to kind of wrestle with this. Every eye is going to be closed. The lights are so bright I can't even see you. So I want to give you just a moment between you and God. would you be courageous enough just to kind of admit that you need some peace in your life? For some of you, maybe you come here today and there's no peace in your heart and your relationship with God. And you go to church, or you've gone to church in the past, maybe you grew up in the church and you haven't been for years. And you just feel like you're disappointed. You just feel like you let him down, or you're so disconnected from him. So I just want to ask you just to take a courageous step. If you feel like you just need some peace in your relationship with God, would you just raise your hand right where you're at? Just say, God, I just need your peace in my life. I don't want to run from you. I don't want to be an adversary of yours. I just want some peace. You can put your hands down. Maybe for some of you today, you have a friendship that's just sideways. And no matter what you do, it just doesn't seem to right itself. And you used to be really good friends with someone, and they said something about you, or they thought you said something about them. They misunderstood you. You've just grown apart. And you just need some peace in your friendships. If that's you, would you just raise your hand right where you're at and just ask God to bring his peace into some relationships in your life? Thank you. You can put your hands down. For some of you, you would categorize the peace that you don't have as a result of an ex-husband, an ex-wife, an ex-boss, an ex-girlfriend, an ex-boyfriend. You have tried to reconcile, it just hasn't worked. Obviously the relationship wasn't able to be saved, but your heart is still damaged. And if you just need God's peace in that, would you just raise your hand right now? You put your hands down, thank you. For some of you, it's your marriage relationship. It's hanging on by a thread, or it's so distant, you don't really understand why. For some of you, it's not even bad, it's just kind of cruise control. And you just need some peace. You need some peace in the human relationship that means the most to you. If that's you, would you just raise your hand right now? Thank you, it's really courageous. God, we just come before you that we're just broken, vulnerable. We don't have it all together. We don't have all the answers. We're on a journey together to be people of peace. Would you help us not be passive? Would you help us not to be reactionary, but to be proactive, to be dispensers of peace, to bring peace into a room, to bring peace into our homes, to bring peace into our workplace, to bring peace into friendships and relationships? Would you help us to be known as people of peace? It's not easy, but it's possible. And it's a goal of ours to be people of peace.